Welcome again to the 2023 Library of Congress National Book Festival. We are here today on the Understanding stage, which is sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts, and we're thankful for them and their patronage. My name is Anya Kreitney, and I'm a specialist in the library's Literary Initiatives Division, one of the departments that's critical in the development of today's festival. It really is a special treat to be joined by the two writers on stage today, Nicole Seeley and Shane McCrae. Nicole is the author of 3 books of poetry, the winner of a Rome Prize in Literature, the Stanley Kunitz Memorial Prize, alongside fellowships from Cave Canem Foundation, Princeton University, among others. Shane is the author of 10 books of poetry, including In the Language of My Captor, which was a finalist for a National Book Award, and Sometimes I Never Suffered, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Shane has won a Whiting Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, among others. Now, there's a lot to dig into today, and I'm delighted to talk to these two, but we will make sure to leave your time for your questions at the end, rather. So please be thinking of questions you want to ask Nicole and Shane while we have our conversation. Nicole and Shane, welcome to both of you. You really each have written such beautiful, special, searing books. They really help me think differently about memory, about witness, and also the force and direction of language, like the impulse of language, what language wants in a way, if that makes sense to you. Nicole, your book is spare and elegiac and full of stops and starts. Shane, your book is propulsive and elliptical and concerned really with its own making. But I really did come away from both books feeling the result of the radical and life-changing result of systematic or even sometimes systemic racism. Nicole, I want to start with you. Your book is called The Ferguson Report, and because I like a show and tell, I'm going to show it up to everyone here. And in the book, you create poems by erasing or redacting parts of the actual Ferguson Report, of course. And the Ferguson Report was a document produced by the Department of Justice summarizing their investigation into the death of Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson in 2014. Since this week, almost to the day, marks the anniversary of Michael's death, I thought we could start with a poem, perhaps as a tribute to Michael, and I wonder if you wouldn't read the first poem, first lifted poem from the book.
I'd love to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya, and thank you to the festival for having us, and to all of you for spending a moment with us. This is only my second time reading from this book, so bear with me. Horses, hundreds, neighing, part reflex, part reason, part particular urge. At gunpoint among them, you are. Less likely to live, into the wild go the captive born. Home in the high grass, a barking dog chokes itself against the pull of a tight leash. Its neck extending farther than cries for help, a kind of headlight echoing, increasing in reach. The forecast red, the city red, diminishing to the proportion of whoever said death comes in threes is an optimist.
Thank you. You know, since there have been, sadly, so many deaths of Black men at the hands of police since 2014, I wonder, just by way of context, if you could remind the audience the circumstances of Michael's death.
Sure, I can do that. So as you said, Anya, almost 9 years to the day, Michael Brown, an 18-year-old teen, was with his friend, a few years older, maybe 21, 22, walking down the middle of suburban Ferguson Street when Darren Wilson drives by and shouts to them, "Get on the sidewalk." Some words are exchanged. Darren from his car, the teens from the street. Darren then gets out his car, confronts the young men, and more words exchanged. The situation escalates, and Darren Wilson shoots 12 times. 6 of those bullets hit Michael Brown, killing him. And I want to say, I think I remember, for 4 hours, Michael Brown lay on the street. So that's the day. And I also want to say that the Ferguson report, it doesn't detail the death of Michael Brown so much as it details bias policing and court practices in Ferguson, Missouri. There was another report that was published the same day, which does that.
Yeah. Tell us about your impulse to contend with Michael's death, right? We're 9 years past his death, and you just mentioned there are several documents, right? And as I was reading the Ferguson report, because it's an act of erasure, I wanted to read what was being erased, right? Mm-hmm. And then that led me to the police report, and that led me to the articles, as a refresher, since it's been so many years.
Yeah.
And I thought about the strictures, right, that you must have imposed upon yourself. So tell us about your impulse to contend with Michael's death and the report itself. Tell us about the conceit of the book.
Of course. So like many of you all, I was moved by the story, so to speak, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. And I read and reread the Ferguson report to try to get some kind of clarity on what had happened, what kind of environment was set up to have such a situation take place. And so just trying to engage with what had happened, with the report. I read it and reread it, mm-hmm. and during that time, I began instinctively erasing, like out of nowhere, just erasing it, as if to, in some way, undo some of the harm that had been done. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until maybe 3/4 of the way into my erasing did I think, oh, this might be a thing.
Right.
So I didn't go into my obsession with the report with the collection in mind. Mm-hmm. It just kind of happened.
Yeah. It was an act of refusal or a rewriting, if you will. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Shane, I want to bring you into the conversation. Your memoir, Pulling the Chariot of the Sun, a memoir of kidnapping. This is it here, guys. If I was to describe the jacket copy alone to the audience here, that your biological grandmother kidnapped you when you were 3, almost 4, that you lived with she and her husband, who you subsequently call, for a long period of time, your grandfather, who's abusive, both of whom are white supremacists, and that's the rationale they use for your kidnapping. It would only be part of the story of, this beautiful, lovely, propulsive book. And it occurred to me that what I walked away from it was this idea of memory and reckoning with the loss that you have absolutely no benchmark for as a child. That to me is the kernel of the book. And I wonder if you wouldn't read just a short passage from the book.
Sure.
It comes from a section that's called 5 Deaths, and consequently it's broken up into 5 sections. So if you could read number 2, I think it's a nice summary for those in the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Anya, and also thank you to the festival and on all of y'all here. Okay. I was born 3 months before my mother's 19th birthday in a hospital my father hadn't visited, or had visited, but not after I was born, or was prevented from visiting by my grandparents. No story about my life before I was old enough to remember my life was stable throughout my childhood. My grandparents told me I never met my father, that he didn't know and didn't care to know where I was, but also that a relative of his stole my Christmas presents when I was an infant. Whereas my mother told me I had, as an infant, lived sometimes with her, sometimes with him. If my grandparents wanted to successfully kidnap me, they had to make sure I didn't know myself. That is the lifelong labor of kidnapping a child. And even now, after a lifetime of wondering about such things, my urge to know the details of my past is dampened by my fear of discovering that nothing I know about my past is true. This fear is the only constant feature, the only true feature of my identity that my upbringing will allow. A child can be raised to participate in their own disappearance for the rest of their life.
It seemed to me that that last line, I mean, the whole thing is so elegantly written, but the last line, a child can be raised to participate in their own disappearance for the rest of their life. If there was a thesis statement for the book, it seems to me like you were unpacking this idea over and over with all different kinds of technique to describe this disappearance, this erasure. I wonder, you know, also thinking, Nicole, about your poems here, if you can talk about this idea of erasure, this disappearance over time, this eroding of self, because it's really consequential. Can you talk a little bit about that for everyone?
Sure. Well, I can at least talk about sort of the mechanism of my kidnapping, which I think was sort of operating via not just disappearance, but erasure. And I'm not entirely sure how conscious my grandparents were of what they were doing in that regard. But conscious or not, they were very effective working toward this idea that in order for the kidnapping to work, eventually I would have to participate in it.
Right.
You know, if you've got a kidnapped child sort of rebelling against their kidnapping all the time, it's very difficult to extend that kidnapping over a lifetime, which is what they were trying to do.
Right.
And so I just found out a week ago that when I was kidnapped, I was almost 4 years old. I had a sense that it happened when I was 3, but I never knew what time of year until, like I said, about a week ago. And so I was pretty far along. And, you know, I had spent a lot of time with my father, and I had lived with him for stretches. And my grandparents, in order to make what they were doing work, had to sort of erase my sense of having been with my father. And so a couple strategies they had for that. One was they started telling me, I don't know how quickly, that I was 18 months old when my mother decided that I should live with them, that it would be easier for her. They didn't bring my father into that equation because they said that he hadn't wanted me, but also they erased more than 2 years of my life. And they started doing that, I'm pretty sure, really very quickly after I was taken, which not only sort of destabilizes my memory, but also destabilizes my sense of who I am entirely, because I'm almost 4, or 4 probably at the time when they're really getting into it, and they're telling me, oh, but you know, you've been with us for 2 years, and I know I haven't.
Right.
And so that was part of how they did it. Another part of how they did it was, you know, as I said in the excerpt I read, they told me that he never wanted me anyway, but then they came up with some weird stories. One was, you know, I had never seen him, but also that he was living in Brazil. He wasn't living in Brazil, but that he was living in Brazil with totally different kids, whole new family. All of this sort of thing was meant to get me to sort of, I guess it's a form of gaslighting. It's to get me to sort of question my own memories about my childhood until I just stopped believing them. And so, in reality, I'm sort of erasing myself. They can't do that for me, but they can condition me to do it to myself.
Yes, over time. Yeah. I mean, there's much debate now about the term gaslighting, how appropriate it is or isn't, or misused. Sure. And as you were talking, that's the word that it comes to me, this act of deliberate cruelty over time for their own purposes. And you know, part of the reason that we put you two together on the panel today is it was this concept of erasure, the slow eroding over time, right? Yours was physical in real life, happened to you. Nicole, yours was an actual physical omission, right? An actual striking through to produce something else, to bear witness to someone else, to tribute to somebody else. And the story itself is full of holes by design. You could say the same is true of your story, Shane. But on paper, the devices you use to tell this story is almost the opposite. It's full of accretion. It's full of repetition and looping narratives and scenes, lines, whole stories repeat over and over and over to this really elegant effect, really meaningful and telling effect. Yeah. I wonder if you can talk about the actual construction of the memoir and this idea about the repetition. And it occurred to me that it could be a byproduct of your memory, or it could also be you writing into the memory.
Sure.
So tell me how you came to it, how conscious you were of it as you wrote.
Sure, thank you for noticing that. Yeah, it's, you know, I guess because the main writing that I do is poetry.
Right.
I'm very interested in technique. I'm trying to figure out how to write a thing. And because I was doing a totally different kind of writing for the memoir, I suppose the first questions I was asking myself was, you know, what do I remember, and how can I be honest about what I remember? And
Yeah.
as a consequence of my childhood, both the kidnapping and my grandfather being extremely abusive, I started blocking painful memories really, really young. But one thing that has happened is I've kind of never stopped just blocking memories. Even though I'm far removed from that abuse, my mind is constantly consuming itself. And so my memory, generally speaking, is really, really poor.
Right.
And, you know, I have a few solid memories from my childhood, and then there are other things that I know happened that I can't remember clearly. And so the reason the memoir is written the way it is twofold. One, because I'm trying to be honest to that experience. I'm trying to write sort of what it is like to both know something has happened but not really remember it, and how you kind of circle around the thing to try to get a hold of it. But the other the other part of the technique has to do with when I actually do remember something, I write down as much as I possibly can remember. I saw there was like a Goodreads review, and the person was saying, you know, Shane, you don't need to write, you know, every time you turned left or whatever. And I'm thinking, no, but I'm so excited that I remember that I turned left, and so I have to write it down.
Right.
You know, because there's just so little I remember that it's a real pleasure in the midst of writing a book that was full of a lot of unhappiness. Just a pleasure to remember that I turned left a certain day to do a thing, you know. And so I gotta write that down. And so really, what I'm trying to do with the way the book is written, you know, that it continues to come back to certain things, that it repeats certain things, is figure out how to capture my own experience of memory, but in a way that I hope communicates not only my own experience to others, but also evokes for them experiences that they have had with their memories.
Yeah, I have to say you were very effective, because at one point in reading the memoir, I started to have these own memories of my child, things that you dredged up in me. And at one point, I just started writing them down because I had this fear that I myself would forget the memories that you had elicited from me.
Sure.
And at one point you mentioned, I have to say, Caro's, as an aside, you mentioned Caro's. I hadn't heard anyone talk about that restaurant in 20 years. Anyway, it was a delight. Yeah, it was a delight. I really appreciated. But I also think that there's something poetic, there's something ruminative and attentive about the way in which you loop and rehearse, and also something I felt like that was childlike in a way, because when you're a child, there's this presumption that children don't have a deep inner life, that they're not attentive to things all the time. And I felt like, especially the moments in the grocery stores and your attention to the way that the store functioned and a car functions, it felt to me true. I mean, aside from the fact that you are building your own memory and proud that you have your own memory, it felt to me accurate. So I appreciated the accuracy and the genuine spirit of it as well. Nicole, I want to get your thoughts. You talked a little bit about process, and you got to the middle of the book, you realized you had something, right? You had a thing. And at that point, you wanted to continue, presumably. Did you have a sense of how, where it was going at that point? Tell me more about the completed redaction, right? You had to complete the rest of the report. And what were you writing toward?
I don't know. I don't know what I was writing toward. I think that was part of what was so interesting and surprising about the project. I just know I had to continue.
Right.
This collection is a little different. I've written found poems before. I have a cento in my first book, and a cento is a poem made up of lines by other poets, usually 100 lines long, and so that's a found poem. The Erasure, too, is a found poem. So this kind of gathering of language was very similar in the process, but that language was different. Where the cento pulled from poems that I admire and love, you know, the Erasure pulled from this document that was disheartening, to say the least. It was difficult. It was difficult to be in the report for as long as I was. I was erasing for several years, 6 or so. And to live there, reading and rereading, was a lot. Quite honestly, I'm glad to be finished.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Glad to be finished.
Traumatic to reread and reread. And as you mentioned, the report itself documents all the ways in which the disenfranchisement in the community, right? That's the bulk of the actual report, is the various ways in which the police and the city of Ferguson profited off of everyday Black Americans, right? They ultimately used them as a way to subsidize the city. And so I can imagine reading and rereading that over and over, knowing how that is both a symbol and also perfectly describes other disenfranchisement in the US. I can imagine. So congratulations for sticking with it despite the emotional toll. I know that was real. Both your books bear witness, you know, albeit in totally different ways. I just wonder what each of you think about the act of bearing witness. There was really no way that I could read your books and not think about witness and all of its meaning. And Jane, you have this lovely passage in the book about the test of memory being a loyalty test of oneself, really. I'm wondering if what you can say about bearing witness, and both of you, if you think it's something that you can only do retroactively, like looking backward. Is it something that, or can you do it in the moment? What do you think? What do you think?
Well, you know, there's that story about the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, where she's waiting outside of a prison that her son is in, and there's another woman behind her who recognizes Akhmatova. Akhmatova is a very famous poet. And, you know, they're sort of in the midst of a nightmare, in the midst of a horror, and the woman says to Akhmatova, you know, can you write this? And Akhmatova says, I can. And that, to me, is an example of bearing witness right at the moment. Because what Akhmatova is doing by acknowledging and sort of promising in a way that she will write about this is bearing witness for the woman who asked if she could. And in that sense, having sort of an immediate, I would assume, positive effect, which is one of the things that I think bearing witness can do. You know, I tend to worry, as I think most folks do, I guess, about, you know, to what extent can I bear witness for other folks, particularly when my own sense of myself is so full of, you know, holes. But, you know, I think that the effort, at least, is important, and I think that maybe a difference between an act of bearing witness that is successful, that, you know, communicates something useful, helpful to a witness or reader of that act, is an acknowledgement of the subjectivity of the witnesser, as opposed to this kind of pretending that, you know, one is bearing witness from a universal position.
Nicole, what do you say?
You asked about retroactively bearing witness, and I think that's where I live mostly. It reminds me of this Forster quote, how do I know what I think until I've seen what I said? Right? So for me, it takes a minute to kind of digest what has happened, what I've seen, what I've read, right, before I can thoughtfully say something about it.
Right.
And so I think that's where this book comes in, right? It took me all these years to really digest what happened in Ferguson. And I think many of my projects, if not all of them, requires that time to fully engage with what happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the impulse now in our current culture is speed, right?
Yeah.
And so the way in which poetry, and Shane, it's clear that you're a poet writing a memoir, slows the attention, slows the deliberate focus, so that we get something that is ruminative and considered and useful, which I think is the real thing. You know, I think you have an author's note, Nicole, in the back that talks a little bit about the use of the poem that you were writing toward like a useful, productive future or some possibility of a future. And that's what I think these poems do ultimately, which I think is so productive. You mentioned a little bit, Shane, that your grandparents, you know, they kidnapped you, and in order basically to erase your blackness, to erase your father's blackness. Of course, the irony is that they ended up raising, I don't know if you want to use the word raising, but raising a black child. So, you know, like so much that is paradoxical about race and racism and white supremacy is that, you know, they saw you as raceless only after they used it as the conceit for their illegality. So, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, you talked a little bit about whether or not they were aware while you were raised, but this paradox, what does it elicit in you?
Well, you know, I think people often have, you know, questions about that. Like, if they're racist, why would they raise a black child? Which I always, you know, I recognize why it's a paradox, but also like, well, because that's really speaking to how racism works, what racism is.
Exactly.
You know, one can't help but experience it personally. One can't help but feel it directed towards one as a personal animosity. But racism is about groups. It's not about individual people. You can't be, although this is going to sound a little odd maybe, you can't be personally racist against an individual. That's not racism.
Right.
That's just hating somebody.
Right.
That's a different thing. And so what ends up happening is, you know, they were racist against black people, against brown people, against anybody not like them.
Right.
But I was in their home, the child of their child.
Right.
And after having me for who knows how long, I assume not too long, but maybe in a way this feeling kind of never leaves, I ceased to represent any group and sort of become an individual. Right. And that's how I think they navigate that.
Yeah, well put. Nicole, I wonder if you wouldn't read another poem for us. It comes from section 3 in the report. I believe it's the second poem in the lifted section.
The birds one.
Let me pull it up for you, one sec. In the bushes, beginning in the bushes. Yeah.
In the bushes, next to the lot, across the street, a rustling like back talk, a deer. The animal out of nowhere flees, seconds too late. A design oversight assigned to that particular beast. On the police radio, a song, a threat, a slip of tongue in an ear. Moist as an eye. Approached, the deer stiffens, a telltale sign the conditions under which it ran were breaking the skin, worse, training the mind. Who among us is stunned by how fast rain pours from the sky? Stunned by how the sky, clear at first, self-corrects, as if to say, I mean this, not that. that, not this.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem. I asked you to read it because it does two things. I mean, of course, it evokes Michael Brown's death, the terror, the visceral bodily nature of it, right? I see that for sure. But it also enacts the sort of stereotyping that's used against us, right? This likening us to wild animals, beasts even, that any response, any address is considered backtalk or punishable by force. And then the insidious part, the latter half of the poem, you call it the training of the mind, right? This stereotyping over time, this erosion of self, that we begin to believe these messages, these erroneous, these false ideas about ourselves. And then, of course, this lovely metaphor of the rain as if it was so natural, an act of nature. It's a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
I wonder, here we are in 2023. We are experiencing new and profound ways of disenfranchisement. I'm wondering what feels more palpable to you, like going wide, killing the system, killing the stereotype, the schisms that cause this sort of interior collapse, or individually challenging that notion that we believe somewhere in ourselves, or were raised at some point culturally to believe or participate in our own erasure. What do you think part of the answer is in terms of being 2023? I know this is a big old question, but what could help us? What could help us move forward?
That's a question for the
That's
ages.
a question. That's a question. And even if it's just something personal, even if it's small ways that you feel, poetry is part of it for you.
Of course.
What feels palpable, and it doesn't have to be the whole world, but what feels palpable to Nicole Seeley?
Yeah, I mean, I think folks engaging with the world, right, looking beyond themselves, to see that there are other ways of being, other ways of living, right? I think that there is a lack of empathy and just a want of engagement with others who might not look like us.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps stepping out of our own comfort zone and feeling uncomfortable might provide a way into empathy. So I would say, get uncomfortable.
Get uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Shane, what say you?
Mine's related, I think. At least for my own personal life, I would say what works for me is like, I guess the phrase I would use is owning the enemy. Like there's this poet named Alan Tate. He's not much read anymore. He was a significant figure of sort of mid-20th century American modernism. And he also happened to be pretty racist. His views evolved a little as he got older, but when he was younger, he was pretty virulently racist. It's all through his poems. And I find that, I've read all of his poems, and I've taken, what is useful for my own work from him,
right.
And I use that to make my poems better. I don't allow his narrowness to exclude me from benefiting from what good there is in his work, And so, acknowledging the at times terribleness of people who have come before, but also trying to acknowledge what benefit they can have to one's own work, I find really beneficial.
That's meaningful. To push back what is toxic, what is incorrect, and to use what is capable. Shane, part of what I garnered from your book, right, is to be alive is to have memory. There's no way that you can be alive and not have memory. And that to intentionally interrogate them, to retell them, to invite others to participate and confirm them is critical. Like that's a critical practice of just being alive, right, is to share our memory. I'm wondering for you what that practice looks like now, having spent so much time writing this book. How has it changed for you? And maybe there's some way that we could be doing it communally better. Maybe there's some way in which we could be sharing better.
Yeah, you know, that's, I think it's true that being alive is memory. And this is really something that I've thought about an awful lot. And there are sort of practical, immediate ways in which this is true, and we should all be aware of them, and it's useless to know. For example, you know, sound travels at a particular speed, and so you can never actually hear the present moment. Light travels at a particular speed, so you can never actually see what's happening right now. You're always a little bit behind it. It is impossible to perceive the present. Even touch sensations travel from the skin to the brain at a particular speed. You can't be alive. Everything in the present moment, everything is retrospective.
Yes.
As a physical being. But also, for the longest time, I was really fixated on this idea that sort of being alive is having some sense, which is memory, having some sense of a continued consciousness, you know? And it's only been recently, and I think it's partly the result of thinking so much about this stuff in the book, that I've realized that there is no continuous consciousness as I have fantasized it. There's only memories of times when I've thought about how I want to have a continuous consciousness.
Yeah.
Like there's not, you know, the actual feeling of moving from every moment to the next moment.
Right.
It's really just the present moment with regard to perception. And so I think that what thinking about memory so much has done for me with regard to trying to live my life is it has helped me to develop an awareness that I don't need to have mastery of my own memory to be happy about my life.
Well put, Shane. Yeah, and memory is mutable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing, to give one permission for memory to be changeable, immediate, and also bizarre. I mean, that's something I got in your book, the permission of it, to remember as you remember, and to challenge that memory. Nicole, what do you think? I mean, your book you could describe as being a memory or a testament, right, to Michael, right? Is there some way that you started to think about your memory of the time? Is there some way that you felt closer to either Michael's memory or to that period in time as you wrote, as you erased and recreated?
Well, as you know, it took several years for me to finish the book. And so while those 6 years were happening, other things were happening as well.
Right.
You know, other Black people were being murdered by police. And so the work couldn't help but to be infected with the future, so to speak, you know, from 2014 to the present. I have one poem, one excerpt in the book that alludes to George Floyd, right? And so I think with this collection, I was traveling through time, and as things were happening, I would in some way internalize those things and then regurgitate on the page. So the collection then is both looking at the case of Michael Brown, the Ferguson report that followed, and then traces, you know. So it's difficult to pin down.
Yeah. I know the moment that you're talking about in the book, the moment that you evoke George Floyd. And I have to tell you, I have to thank you, because at the time that he was killed, I was pregnant and was just about to give birth. And I knew I had this deep sense that I should watch, because I had felt like I had a responsibility to bear witness to him, whether or not I was prepared or not. And I couldn't. I was pregnant, and I felt that I just couldn't fit it in my body. I couldn't, there wasn't room. There physically wasn't room at the time.
I've not watched it.
Say that again?
I've not watched the footage.
And
I couldn't.
I understand that instinct, I really do. Your poem gave me courage I couldn't watch the whole thing, but I watched it in part. And I felt like, wow, what a testament, what an act of supreme bravery you gave me from the poem itself. I really felt prepared to do something that I felt was for him, and what little that I could do. And you all talked about, like, there's no immediacy, right? Everything happens, you're realizing, it happens in the present, but you realize later. It felt the same way for me, right? It took me that many years to feel prepared to even watch a segment of it, and I couldn't do it alone. I needed your book to do it. So it was really deeply meaningful in terms of an act. What a generous gift you gave me. So it was really, really lovely. Shane, I want to ask you a somewhat personal question. Your grandmother developed Alzheimer's in the last 10 to 15 years of her life. And of course, as we know, that disease erodes your memory. And to me, it seemed like a shocking parallel. And I mean, dare I say, poetic justice. I wonder how you square yourself with that, you know. And I also wondered, selfishly for you, were there things that she couldn't answer for you that you wanted to know because she couldn't herself remember?
You know, let me start with the second part. There really wasn't anything that she couldn't answer that I wanted to know. I wasn't asking her.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that wasn't a problem. With regard to her developing Alzheimer's, really the only feelings I've had about it are the feelings I continue to have, which is I wish it hadn't happened. You know, it's a terrible disease. And, you know, I don't really think about it in terms of how she treated me or in terms of my own experience or relationship with memory. I think of it in terms of her own humanity, which she didn't sacrifice by doing terrible things. And I just wish it hadn't happened to her.
What a generous way to describe it. Very generous indeed. You know, there's a part your story, Shane, that could appear as sensational, right? And could be easily sensationalized, right? And I think that would miss the forest through the trees. And so I wonder how you struggled with balance, right, when you're creating, because you're writing a memoir. You do need it's not a book of poems. You do need some arc of story, right, in as you construct this thing. So if you could talk a little bit about the balance, like how you thought about that. I was thinking about that myself as I was reading.
Sure, I thought about it all the time, and I still think about it. It is a story that, you know, if you put it in a little capsule, it sounds like a book that one wants to read for the information in it. You know,
right?
Like,
exactly.
It sounds like it's an exciting book about some terrible thing, and
right.
I want to read this book.
Exactly.
And I worry so much because I don't want somebody to come to the book thinking they're going to get this, like, you know, almost like a true crime story.
Right.
And like I'm thinking about like Virginia Woolf when I'm writing it. Like I don't, you know, that's like
right,
I'm worried about like what are my sentences like and how can I make this like big tapestry so that the book is almost more like a single sensation than it is like a big long breath than it is like, you know, here's information, here's information, here's information. The balance, I think, honestly kind of took care of itself, though, because what I care about is writing, you know, as opposed to like selling a particular story.
Right.
So that like what I had to do is worry about getting lost in the writing of it. And so I had to like give myself some simple rules. You know, there was a word count that I had to meet. And, you know, I had to keep a sense of chronology. I wanted people to be able to follow the story from A to B to C. Yeah. And as long as I held those sort of basic things in mind, I felt like I was free to write it however I wanted it, as long as I could make sure that people could follow the history from place to place to place. But I also don't know that I'm capable of writing this sensationalized version.
Yeah. It struck me that, and that's why I opened with this idea of this book jacket, right? This idea about selling something, because it seems what you're attending to the book is so opposite. You know, it's so ruminative and personal, and it invites such personal and contemplative reflection. I just don't want you all to leave out of the room feeling like that is the thing, that's the thing that I invite you to participate in the book, because it's done so beautifully. It really, really is.
Thank you.
In a minute or two, I'll open it up for questions, but you both have very thoughtful endings to topics that don't end. Shane, I thought, how is he going to end this, right? It would be too pat to say, you found your father, right? That would be too pat, too easy. And instead you zoom out. And I won't want to give the whole thing away, but the way in which you handle the ending, the sort of undulating wave of the ending, is just so thoughtful. And Nicole, I thought of you, here getting to the end of the report and being relieved, and being relieved by the end of the report, but then the violence continues, right? So, I don't know if this is, I hope you can grasp what I'm saying, but could you talk about endings? Is there a way in which you feel that, or does the work just continue in a new manifestation with back to poems, as you are both poets? What do you think?
Well, for me, as I mentioned just a minute ago, I was thinking about Virginia Woolf. I really was. I was thinking about, that I find my father is in the book kind of from the beginning, so that's not really like a spoiler. But as I said, one of the things that made it possible for me to write the book was thinking about technique, and I was thinking about the ending of Mrs. Dalloway, which is my favorite ending in literature, just that really short sentence where there she was. And I wanted to write, and I don't want to say the last sentence of my book, but I wanted to write to a sentence like that, to have just like a really short sentence that somehow spoke to everything that was happening in the book. And so really what I was thinking of was, how do I get there? How do I get to a way to make this ending work? And so, as it always is for me, it was a question of technique. And now it is back to trying to write poems.
No more memoirs for you, no more prose. Nicole, what do you think?
I think I wanted to end the book with the lifted poems because I wanted to give some direction to the language. As you know, the erasure is punctuationless. The reader places emphasis where they decide. Although, the words are kind of separated, letters are separated from words in a way that creates breath. But there is no punctuation in the erasure. I wanted it to end with the lifted poems because I wanted to give direction. I wanted the reader to be with me on this journey as I kind of direct the poems, direct breath, direct enjambment. And so I thought that was important to let the reader into my practice in that way, right? And the excerpt that ends the collection, I think, is one that ends with a bit of hope. Although it can seem a bit hopeless as we, go about our days and there's always another and another and another. It ends, I think, with whatever, now I have to remind myself how it ends. My second time reading this book.
Why don't you read the poem?
Oh, that makes sense.
That helps.
Attention, history, temperamental as it's sold, wishes to remain anonymous in nature, name, and potential consequence, ensuring a number of revisions, alternate endings, exact dates as appropriate. At the window, a figure, separate his offenses, motions for me to get closer. With an ear to the glass, I remain silent. Anything you say can and will be. So a bit hopeful.
Well, and also the double play, can and will be used against you, right? So the revision of it, can and will be, is so profound. You know, I thank you for mentioning the lifted poems, because it was a question I had. You know, as I was reading, I created alternate pathways, because of course, as you read the text, you know, there's these long sequences where there's nothing, right? So you can create your own grammar, your own syntax with the poems. And it provided meanings, of course, double meanings, triple meanings that I presume you were hoping readers would find.
Yeah.
In fact, one I found was, it's stop or I'll shoot he kids in the lifted. But I read it, stop or I'll shoot the kids. And it it just reminded me how young Michael was, right? And how young some of these folks are, who these members of our community who are suffering such violence. And so it was another mode, another point at which you offered me something. So I was grateful for the lifted poems and the double meanings and the direction that you provided. You don't give the way that you structure we talked about endings. I just have a question about the beginning of the book. I'm realizing now you offer no page number, right? It's all just section, as in you report to the section and the book, but you don't offer, it's all 000. You don't offer orientation in that way. What was the gesture there?
I actually think you have an arc.
Oh no, there are, okay.
So there are page numbers. So I think folks who have seen the arc saw the work.
Okay.
Before it was ready for print.
This is what you get when you have a publishing date that's so close to a festival. So anyway, for those who are thinking of questions, please come to the mic and share your questions with Shane and Nicole. Please don't be shy.
Hello, I'm Mila. I was inspired by the discussion of erasure and redaction and history and memories, because I see memories being reflected as individual, but history being reflective as a collective memory of our past. And so in both stories, in both portrayals, there's a discussion of race, there's a discussion of erasure. And I'm curious of your thoughts of our circumstances where there seems to be a pervasiveness of erasure of our history, of our collective history, tied to race and the impacts that that will have. And both of you in some way are historians, but you tell your story and reflect history in a very eloquent way. But how do you see the current state and how we might move forward to avoid erasure of our collective history?
Do you want to?
I think you'd be better at it than me.
Again, another question for the ages, I don't know if I have an answer. I don't know if I have the answer. I think all we can do is continue to tell our stories, tell it best we can, and really continue to make noise. I think that's my answer. Continue to make noise and continue to tell our histories and advocate for ourselves and our stories.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's pretty much what I would say. Just sort of remain conscious. If we can't have a sort of community memory of a deep history, we can be conscious of the history that we have made, and trying to hold on to that and be conscious of it is one way to fight erasure.
Thank you for your question.
How are you doing? I've really enjoyed this. I want to take this in a different direction. I just want to share with you some numbers and get anything that you want to share. In 2019, this is from the FBI website, 251 black males were killed by police officers, law enforcement. In the same year, 2,574 were killed by other black males. Why are we focused on the former rather than the latter?
Oh, are we focused on that?
We've not mentioned anything about the 2,000 as opposed to the 200. I think that be more focused on what's really hurting our community, more so than certainly what's hurting our community, but not at a level as to what we're doing to one another.
Okay.
Well, I guess.
And I'd love to hear her opinion as well.
Oh, okay.
No, both.
All I was going to say is I guess that's not what our books are about,
Right.
and so that's why we've not been talking about it, at least for
Yeah.
me.
But perhaps we should be, I guess is my point.
Well, perhaps that's the book you need to write.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question for, first for Nicole. I'm writing a fictional memoir and, as a prose narrative, but I'm curious, you read your poem and it had a narrative form, but it was sort of like meta-narrative. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between poetry and narrative form fiction as a form of writing narrative. What are the sort of contours of each of them? You could have written that poem as an essay, obviously.
Yeah, I guess I could have. I would say my poems, in general, in my first book and this one, they're more lyrical than narrative, right? And so my poems tend to take leaps and they turn and things happen out of nowhere, right? And so with this book in particular, there wasn't a narrative because for whatever reason, the language didn't allow for me to create a traditional narrative, right? With the language provided in the Ferguson Report, it wasn't inspiring.
Right.
The language at all was not inspiring. And so I had to create lyrical moments where there were none. And so that's where my imagination really came into play. And you'll see in the book that I created words from words, right? So I'll use a letter from one word and a letter from another word to create another word because the language was so dense and kind of legally and all that to say, I don't know how I do what I do. I just know that it's more lyrical than narrative. And because the report is what it is, I had to create something out of nothing, which is what we do best, I think.
Right.
Well, so you didn't ask me personally, but I've
No, I directed it to both of you. But
good, because I've written a lot of narrative poetry, an awful lot of it, and so and it's a thing I think about kind of constantly. It's at the top of my mind because narrative poetry for the last 30 or 40 years has been uniformly pretty bad. And so what I would say, sort of the differences and the thing that a narrative poet has to be attentive to is a sort of remembering to focus on language and to, write your language at a sort of the pitch of the lyric, but keeping in mind that you're trying to tell a story with that. Because one of the reasons that narrative poetry has been uniformly so bad for decades is because narrative poets have been satisfied with telling the story and thinking that if you break a story into lines, you've done the work. And really the work of the poet is attention to language. And so writing your narrative, focus on your language, and that will make your poem worth reading.
Yeah. I haven't seen the poem that you read on the page, but I like the fact that you break apart and recombine words. That itself becomes a narrative, the creation of, and I consider myself a poet as well as a field writer of novelistic fiction. And I just hadn't thought of that as a poetic strategy. And I wanted to ask you one more question.
I think our time is up.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
We are getting the sign. This is why Nicole's being attentive
So
and very
sorry.
diligent. You know, she's also a teacher, so she's keeping us on time. I just want to thank you both for your beautiful books and for
thank
joining
you,
us
Anya.
here
Thank you.
today. And really, please get their books and get them signed. They're lovely and thoughtful and beautiful. Thanks everyone for joining us.